4 seasons after the river came up and stayed up for 6 days, the men who once stood at the fence line laughing now send their boys down to Ruby Asher's bottom ground to learn how a woman with a mule and a dead man's notebook built rows that would not drown. But to understand how a widow with $16 and a 16-year-old son turned the sorriest 40 acres in Pike County into the only cropland left standing after the water came, you have to go back to the spring. Everybody in Hickory Hollow still calls the year Ruby Asher lost her mind. She was 41 years old that April, and she had been a widow for 3 of them. Vesta Asher had been dead 3 years by then, killed in an afternoon at the sawmill when a green pine kicked back off the carriage and caught him across the chest. And Ruby had buried him on a Tuesday and gone back to milking by Thursday because the cow did not know he was gone and would not wait on grief to be milked. She had one boy, Caleb, 16 that spring, tall as his father had been, and just as quiet. And between the two of them, they worked 41 acres of hill ground that her own father, Grover Asher, had split off from his home place the year she married. Grover kept the good bottom along Troublesome Creek for himself, kept the barn and the 2 best pastures, and gave Ruby the steep back 40 that ran down off the ridge into a wet hollow. The old people called Hickory Bottom, though nobody had farmed the lower third of it in memory. It was swamp. Cattails stood shoulder high in June. In wet years, a man could lose a boot in it and never find the boot. That April, on a Saturday, Ruby walked down into that bottom with Vesta's old leather-cased notebook tucked inside her coat, and she stood at the edge of the standing water with her hems soaking through, and she made up her mind. The notebook had been Vesta's from before they married, when he'd hired out 2 summers with a surveying crew laying section lines for the county before the mill took him on steady. He had kept his own book alongside the company's, full of sketches. Nobody but him could read at first. Elevations, water lines, little arrows showing which way ground shed rain after a hard storm. In the back of it, in pencil, gone soft and grey, he had drawn Hickory Bottom itself, the whole wet 40, with a set of long, low ridges sketched across it like the teeth of a comb, running crosswise to the slope instead of down it. Beside the sketch he had written, in his blocky hand, "Throw the water where you want it and the ground will follow." Ruby had found the book in a cedar chest 8 months after the funeral, looking for a photograph, and she had sat on the floor of the bedroom with it open on her knees until the light went out of the window, reading a dead man's plan for ground neither of them had ever farmed a day of their married life. She did not tell her father what she meant to do. She told Caleb, on the back porch, with the coffee gone cold between them, and she told him plain, "We are going to raise the swamp bottom out of the water, the way your daddy drew it, 1 shovel and 1 mule at a time. And it is going to take us most of a year, and folks are going to say things." Folks said things before she had turned the first spade of dirt. Green Lawson farmed the place next to the Asher land, 110 acres of good upland corn and tobacco that had been in his family longer than the county had had a courthouse, and Green had a way of talking in the feed store that carried. He stood at the counter at Combs Hardware and Feed on a Thursday morning with 3 other men around him and said it loud enough that Ruby, coming in the door for fence staples, heard every word before the bell over the door had finished ringing. Towed ground. "Don't raise a beef cow," he said, "let alone a crop, and everybody in this holler knows it but Vesta's widow, and Lord knows grief does things to a woman's judgment." He said she'd be out there with a shovel, same as trying to dig a well with a spoon. He said the Asher bottom had grown nothing but cattails and copperheads since his own granddaddy's day, and it would grow nothing else after Ruby Asher was through wearing herself out on it. The other men laughed, not unkindly exactly, the way men laugh at a joke they've all agreed is safe to laugh at, and Ruby set her staples on the counter, paid for them, and said good morning to every one of them by name on her way out. She did not answer Green Lawson. She never did. Not once. Not that whole first year. When somebody repeated his words back to her, and somebody always did because Hickory Hollow was a small enough place that an insult traveled faster than the mail, she would say only that she appreciated the concern, or that Green likely knew his own ground better than he knew hers, and she would go back to whatever she'd been doing with her hands. Her silence unsettled people more than an argument would have. An argument gives a man something to push against. Silence gives him nothing. And Green Lawson, by June, had taken to bringing up the swamp bottom to anyone who'd stand still for it, unprompted, as though her quiet were an itch he could not stop scratching. Her father was worse in his way, because he loved her, and said so before he said the rest of it. Grover Asher was 68 that year, still spry enough to walk his own fence line twice a day, and he climbed down off the ridge to stand at the edge of the bottom more than once that spring with his hat pushed back, watching his daughter and grandson stake string lines across standing water. "Ruby," he said the first time, That ground drowned your granddaddy's corn in 1911, and it has drowned every scheme anybody's had for it since. I gave you that 40 because it was the only 40 I had to spare, not because I thought a soul could farm it. He was not cruel about it. He offered, more than once, to let her run cattle on his own good pasture instead, and forget the bottom altogether. Offered to buy her out of the worry, if not the land. But every time he came down to the fence to say it, she showed him the same page of Vesta's notebook, and every time he looked at the pencil sketch the same way, like a man being shown a map to a place he did not believe existed, and shook his head and climbed back up the ridge. Elwood Bowling came through in May, same as he came through every spring, buying up hill ground cheap off widows and old men too tired to farm it anymore, and he stopped his truck at the end of Ruby's Lane, because word of the swamp scheme had reached him same as it reached everybody else within 2 counties. He walked the edge of the bottom in his town shoes, careful of the mud, and made her an offer for the whole 40 acres that would not have covered what Vesta's life insurance alone had left unpaid on the mortgage. "Save yourself a summer of misery, Mrs. Asher," he told her, standing at the truck door with his hat in his hand like he was already at a funeral. "Ground like this isn't worth the sweat you'd put in it." Ruby thanked him for driving out, told him the land wasn't for sale, and watched him back his truck down the lane past Caleb, who was already down in the bottom with the mule, driving the first stake of the first ridge line into ground that gave way soft and black beneath the point. That was the gesture the whole hollow talked about for the rest of that spring. Not a speech, not an argument, just a 41-year-old widow and her 16-year-old son standing knee-deep in a swamp with a stake, a string line, and a dead man's book, laying out a set of ridges that not one living soul besides the 2 of them believed would ever hold water back, let alone hold a crop up. Ruby did not explain herself to the hollow that spring, but she explained herself once, quietly, to Caleb, the evening after Elwood Bowling's truck had disappeared up the lane. They sat on the porch step with the notebook open between them, and she ran her thumb along the pencil ridges in her husband's drawing the way another woman might have touched a photograph. "Your daddy surveyed water for a living before the mill took him," she said. "He used to say a man that fights water loses, but a man that listens to it and gives it somewhere to go can make it work for him instead of against him. This bottom's been drowned because everybody before us tried to fight it straight on. We're not going to fight it. We're going to throw these ridges up crosswise, the way he drew them, and let the water tell us where it wants to walk instead of where we think it ought to." Caleb turned the page back to the beginning of the notebook, to a line of his father's handwriting neither of them had shown to another living soul, and read it out loud into the dark porch. "Ground remembers where the water goes better than any man does. It only wants somebody willing to remember with it." Neither of them said Green Lawson's name that evening. They did not need to. His voice was down there in the bottom with them already. In every shovelful of black mud Ruby turned over the following week, in every ridgeline that rose slow and crooked and imperfect out of ground that had not felt a plough in 40 years, and it would stay there, unanswered, clear through the frost that was coming that winter to prove him half right before the river came, the spring after to prove him wrong for good. Green Lawson found out inside a week, the way anybody found out anything in Pikeville, not from Ruby's mouth, but from the mule tracks cut deep and fresh along the fence line where his good bottomland stopped and her drowned 40 began. He rode the four-wheeler down there himself on a Tuesday morning, engine idling at the property line, and looked out at what she'd already thrown up. 3 low ridges of black mud, crooked as a dog's hind leg, running crosswise instead of straight the way any sensible man would lay furrows. "You're building levees in a swamp, Ruby," he said, not even bothering to cut the engine first. "Swamp doesn't care what shape you pile it in. It's going to come back down flat the first hard rain, same as it always has." She kept the shovel moving. "It's not a levee, Green. It's a ridge. There's a difference." "Difference is what? 6 inches of mud instead of 12? He laughed, short and without much meanness in it, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been cruel. "Your daddy's 40 was underwater 3 seasons out of 5 long before you were born, and it'll be underwater 3 seasons out of 5 long after both of us are dead. I'm not saying it to be ugly. I'm saying it because somebody ought to." Ruby straightened up, palm pressed into the small of her back, and looked at him standing up there dry and unbothered on ground that had never once failed him. "I appreciate you saying it, Green." She did not say anything else. She turned back to the ridge and drove the shovel in again, and after a minute the four-wheeler's engine revved and pulled away. And that silence, the one the playbook of every mocker in Hickory Hollow would come to know before the year was out, sat down in the mud next to her and kept her company the rest of the afternoon. It was Caleb who broke first, not from the work, but from what the work was costing them. 3 Saturdays running, he had missed baseball practice to walk the mule team, and the 4th Saturday he finally said what he'd been chewing on since spring. "Mama, if this doesn't work, we lose the seed money for both fields, not just this one." That was arithmetic he had learned doing the books for her at the kitchen table, and it was arithmetic she could not argue with, because it was true, and because for one long moment, standing ankle-deep in Hickory Hollow mud with her son's worried face in front of her, she let herself feel the shape of the question the whole county was asking without saying it out loud. What if Green's right? What if this is grief wearing a shovel instead of a woman? She did not answer him with certainty, because she did not have certainty to give. She answered him with her father-in-law's notebook, which she had started carrying folded in her back pocket the way some women carried a Bible. "Your daddy surveyed 100 bottoms like this one for the county before the mill took him, Caleb. He used to say water doesn't lie about where it wants to go. It just tells you in a language most men never learn to read. I'm not guessing out here, I'm reading." And then, because the boy needed more than a notebook to stand on, she told him the arithmetic the other way. If the ridges failed, they lost the seed money. Yes. But if they never tried, they lost the 40 acres forever, because nobody was ever going to buy drowned ground from a widow, and nobody was ever going to farm it for her either. Caleb picked the mule lead back up without another word, but she saw him glance down at the ridge crowns before he did, measuring them now instead of just walking past them. The ridges rose slow through June and July, 18 of them eventually, laid crosswise across the bottom exactly as Vesta's pencil lines had shown, each one packed by mule-drawn drag, and then by hand where the drag couldn't reach, each one a little straighter than the one before, as Ruby's eye learned what her husband's eye had already known. Between the ridges she dug the shallow channels his notes called for, not ditches to drain the water away, but paths to let it walk through without drowning the crowns. The way you'd give a restless man somewhere to pace instead of trying to nail his feet to the floor. Grover came down most mornings that summer, watched from the high ground with his hat pushed back and said less than Green did, which worried Ruby more because her father had never once in 68 years been a man who kept his opinions to himself out of kindness. "You know, I dug 2 miles of drainage ditch through Beaver Creek bottom in '58, he said one July morning, apropos of nothing, watching her set a ridge line with a level line strung between 2 stakes. Government paid for it, took 3 men a whole season, never held. Water found its way around every one of them by the second spring. Straight ditches fight the water, Daddy. Vesta's crosswise, and it's built to let the water move through it instead of against it." She kept setting stakes. There's a difference between fighting something and listening to it. Grover didn't answer that either way, but the next morning he showed up with his own shovel, and though he never once said out loud that he'd come around, he worked 3 ridges alongside her without complaint, and that was Grover Asher's way of admitting a thing he wasn't ready to say with his mouth. It was the first loop the Hollow had watched close that summer, not whether the ridges would hold water, which nobody yet knew, but whether Ruby's own father believed in what she was building. By the 2nd week of August, with dirt under both their fingernails, that question had quietly answered itself, even while the bigger one stayed wide open over the whole bottom like a held breath. Elwood Bowling's truck came down the lane in the last week of August, kicking dust ahead of it, and Ruby watched it from the porch with the kind of stillness that told Caleb to stay back and let her handle it. Elwood didn't get out right away. He sat with the window down, looking out at 18 crooked ridges rising out of ground that every deed record in the courthouse still called worthless. And when he finally stepped down, he didn't bother with hello. "Heard you were down here throwing up dirt piles, Ruby. I'll give you 400 an acre for the whole bottom. Take it off your hands, save you the trouble, come first freeze. That's a fair price for swamp." "It's not swamp anymore, Elwood. It's swamp with speed bumps in it," he said, and it was almost gentle. The way he said it, the way a man says something he believes is a mercy. 400's more than fair. Nobody else in this county's going to offer you a dime for it once winter, shows you what I already know. She thought about the seed money Caleb had done the arithmetic on, thought about the frost that hadn't come yet, but was already circling somewhere out past October the way it circled every year, thought about Vesta's handwriting, telling her the ground remembers where the water goes. 400 an acre would have covered near everything she owed and left a little besides, and for one long breath, standing in the yard with Elwood's truck idling behind him, she let herself feel exactly how much 400 an acre was worth to a woman with a 16-year-old boy and a dead husband's notebook and 18 ridges nobody but her and her father believed in. "I'll let you know if the price ever gets better than what I've got," she said, and Elwood Bowling looked at her a long moment, shook his head the way a man shakes his head at a debt he knows he'll never collect, and got back in his truck. He did not say goodbye. He did not need to. Ruby understood, watching the dust settle back down over the lane behind him, that his silence was its own kind of open loop, one that wouldn't close until one of them was proven right by something neither of them controlled. And 3 weeks later, in the last days of October, when the first hard frost of the year came down out of a clear black sky and settled cold and sudden over Hickory Hollow, before a single ridge crown had been given a full season to prove itself, Ruby Asher would learn exactly how much cheaper it was to lose a thing than to almost keep it. The frost came in on a Tuesday, and it did not announce itself the way October frosts usually did in Hickory Hollow, with a slow silvering of the low pasture grass and a morning or two of warning fog. It came down hard and complete in a single night. The sky scraped clean of cloud, the stars sharp as broken glass, and Ruby woke before Caleb's alarm to a stillness in the house that told her something was wrong before she ever looked out the window. She stood at the kitchen glass in her nightgown, with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, and watched the ridges go white in the dark, watched the whiteness creep down off the crowns and into the low rows between them, and she thought of Vesta's handwriting, "The ground remembers where the water goes," and understood, standing there in the cold kitchen with her breath fogging the pane, that the ground was about to be tested in a way no drainage ditch or crushed limestone amendment could answer for. By full light, she was out in it, boots sinking into half-frozen mud, walking the 18 ridges the way she'd walked them all summer, and what she found broke something loose in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel since the day she buried Vesta. 9 of the ridges had held, the crowns high enough, angled enough, that the frost had skated across the surface and left the tender shoots beneath mostly untouched, the way Vesta's notebook had promised, spring water and cold air both moving downhill, the same as anything else moves downhill if you give it a place to go. But the other 9, the ones on the western edge nearest Green Lawson's fence line, where the swamp bottom sat lower and the crowns she and Caleb had thrown up in August, hadn't had time to settle and firm before the ground softened again in September rain. Those 9 had frozen through top to bottom. The plants on them stood black and collapsed by 9 in the morning, wilted the way nothing wilts, except something that has already died in the night without anyone's permission. Caleb found her out there past 10, standing at the edge of the 9th ridge with her hand on a blackened stem, and he didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her the way Vesta used to stand beside things that needed standing beside. "Half," he said finally, doing the arithmetic the way he always did, quiet and fast in his head. "Half of it's gone, Mama," she nodded. She had already done the arithmetic herself, lying awake at 4 in the morning before the frost had even finished falling, and it was worse than half, because the 9 ridges that failed weren't scattered evenly across the good ground and the bad. They were bunched together on the low western third, which meant the seed money, the fertilizer money, the money that would have to carry them and Grover both through winter and into a second planting, had been sunk disproportionately into exactly the ground that had failed her. She did not cry in front of the boy. She had promised herself that much back in the spring, standing in Green Lawson's yard with the first laugh still ringing in her ears, and she held to it now, walking the dead ridges with Caleb at 10 in the morning with the sun climbing pale and useless overhead, doing nothing to warm the black stems back to green. But that night, after Caleb was asleep and the house had gone quiet around her, the way it had gone quiet every night for 3 years, she sat at the kitchen table with Vesta's notebook open in front of her and let herself ask the question she had been outrunning since April. What if they were right? What if Green Lawson standing at the feed store with his thumbs in his belt loops? What if her own father up the hill shaking his head over his coffee? What if Elwood Bowling driving away without so much as a goodbye? What if all of them had simply been seeing plainly what she, grieving and stubborn and half in love with a dead man's handwriting, had refused to see? A woman with a 16-year-old boy and a debt to the feed store and 18 ridges built on a hunch had no business betting the whole of what she had on a notebook. She turned the pages slowly, past the diagrams of crown height and crest spacing, past a margin note in Vesta's cramped hand that red water finds its level whether you want it to or not. Better it finds a place you built for it than one you didn't. And for the first time since she'd started digging in April, Ruby Asher put her head down on her folded arms at the kitchen table and let the doubt come all the way in. It was Grover who pulled her back out of it, though he didn't mean to, and he didn't do it gently. He came down off the hill 2 mornings after the frost, walked the dead ridges himself with his cane sinking into the same half-frozen mud that had nearly turned Ruby's ankle, and stood a long while looking at the black stems before he said anything at all. "I told you a swamp bottom don't forgive a mistake the way good ground does," he said. "Good ground. You're wrong about something. It just costs you a little. Bad ground. You're wrong about something. It takes the whole hand." Ruby waited for the rest of it, the closing argument she'd been bracing for since March, the one that would finally, mercifully, let her agree with him and put the shovel down. But Grover surprised her. He crouched, slow, his knees complaining audibly in the cold, and put his hand flat on one of the 9 ridges that had held, the good ones, where the shoots still stood green and unbothered a foot from where their neighbors lay collapsed and black. 9 held, he said. "Girl, 9 held, and this was the worst frost I've seen come down in October since before your mother passed." He looked up at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there since Vesta's funeral. Something that wasn't quite an apology, because Grover Asher didn't traffic in apologies, but was close enough kin to one that she recognized it. "Half of a bad idea failing was one thing," he said. "Half of a bad idea holding was a different thing altogether, and he wasn't fool enough," he said, "to pretend he couldn't tell the difference." She didn't sleep much that week, but what sleep she got came easier after that, because Grover's math had done something her own grief-fogged arithmetic hadn't been able to do. It had turned the disaster around in her hands and shown her the other side of it. 9 ridges built the same summer, out of the same clay, by the same 2 pairs of hands, and the only ridges that failed were the ones rushed in soft ground with less than 6 weeks to firm before the frost found them. She went back to Vesta's notebook that same night, with a pencil this time instead of just her eyes, and in the margin beside his note about crown height, she wrote her own, underlined twice, "Needs time to set before first frost. Plant western edge first next year, not last." It was not a vindication yet. It was worse than half a crop, and a debt that wasn't going anywhere, and a comprehensive silence from Green Lawson, who had not come around to gloat, which somehow felt worse than if he had, because it meant he'd already written her off as not worth the trouble of gloating over. But it was a different kind of loop than the one that had been sitting in her chest since the frost. Not was I wrong, but what do I do next spring, so I'm not wrong again? And a woman who is asking herself the second question has already, without quite admitting it to herself, answered the first. The town noticed the failure before it noticed anything else. That was the particular cruelty of small places. Word of 9 dead ridges, traveled the length of Hickory Hollow inside of 2 days, carried on the same currents that had carried the original mockery back in the spring, while the 9 that held simply sat there quietly doing their job, unremarked, because a ridge that succeeds doesn't make for conversation the way a ridge that fails does. Ruby heard it secondhand from the Baptist church secretary, who heard it from her sister, who lived 2 farms down from Green Lawson, that Green had told the men at the co-op the swamp woman's foolishness had finally caught up to her, that half her crop had frozen dead in the ground, same as anybody with sense could have told her it would, and that it was only a matter of time now before the bank, or Elwood Bowling, or plain exhaustion finished what the frost had started. Ruby said nothing when the secretary repeated it to her at the grocery, the way she'd said nothing to Green in April, and the woman studied her face for the satisfaction of a good story, and did not entirely find it. Because underneath the exhaustion, Ruby was doing arithmetic the secretary couldn't see. 9 ridges, western edge, 6 weeks, next April, and a woman doing arithmetic does not look from the outside like a woman who is beaten. Winter came down hard and long after that, the way it always did in the hollow, and Ruby spent the cold months the way she had spent them since Vesta died, stretching what money there was and keeping Caleb in school clothes and finding, twice, that she had to choose between the feed store bill and something else and choose the feed store, because livestock did not forgive a missed month the way a woman could sometimes forgive herself one. She did not go back to Elwood Bowling, though she thought about it more than once in January with the wind coming down off the ridge line and rattling the window glass. Thought about $400 an acre and what it would mean to simply stop, to sell the swamp bottom and the notebook's promises along with it, and be done carrying a dead man's certainty on her own back. But every time the thought got far enough to feel real, she found herself walking back out to the 9 ridges that had held, standing in the frozen dusk with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at ground that had done exactly what Vesta said it would do, and the thought would recede again, the way water recedes when it's found the place it's supposed to go. Grover came down more that winter than he had in the 3 years since Vesta's death. ostensibly to check on Caleb's schoolwork or to bring down a mess of squirrel he'd shot on the hill. But Ruby understood well enough what he was really doing, which was watching her. The way a man watches a fence line he isn't sure will hold. He never brought up Elwood's offer again. He never brought up Green Lawson's talk at the co-op. What he did one evening in February, with the wind howling, and the three of them sitting close to the stove, was reach into his coat and set on the table an old surveyor's level, the kind with a brass tube and a bubble of glass, tarnished with age and disuse. "Your grandfather's," he said to Caleb, though he was looking at Ruby when he said it. Man could level a foundation with this thing blind, drunk in a thunderstorm. "Ridges you're throwing up by eye and guesswork," he said, and here his voice had none of the mockery it had carried back in the spring. Only the flat practicality of a man handing over a tool because the work in front of him mattered. A level would make them true the first time, save you rebuilding what the frost already taught you needed. Rebuilding. Ruby took the level in both hands and understood, holding its cold brass weight, that her father had just done something he had not done since Vesta's funeral. He had not told her she was right. He had not admitted the swamp bottom would hold, but he had handed her a tool built for exactness, for a job he expected her to still be doing come spring, and coming from Grover Asher, who measured his approval out in tools and silences rather than words. That was as loud a thing as he knew how to say. Outside, the wind kept working at the house, and somewhere out past the window, the 9 ridges that had held stood waiting under a foot of snow for a season that hadn't decided yet, in either direction, what it meant to do with them. Caleb turned the level over twice in his hands before he set it back on the table, careful. The way he'd been taught to set down anything that had belonged to a dead man, he was named half after. He asked his grandfather how it worked, and Grover showed him holding the brass tube up to the lamp so the bubble slid and settled, and for a moment the two of them bent over it together while Ruby sat back and watched something pass between her father and her son that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the ground outside the window. She let it be. Some things a boy needed to learn from a man's hands and not his mother's telling. It was Green Lawson who broke the quiet of that winter, though not the way she expected. He came up the lane in late February, not to mock, but because his own bottomland along the creek had started backing up water where it never had before, and he wanted to know if she'd seen the same on her side. Ruby stood in the barn doorway with a pitchfork still in her hand and told him plain. The creek was running higher than she'd known it to run in a February, and her ridges were drier than the flat ground on either side of them. And she didn't know what that meant, except that maybe the river was minding to do something big come spring. Green didn't laugh. He looked past her, out at the 9 humped rows standing dark against the frost-whitened flat, and something in his face went thoughtful in a way she'd never seen on him before, not since Vesta died. He said he supposed he'd wasted a lot of breath at the co-op. She told him breath was cheap and didn't cost her anything, and he could waste all of it he wanted. He almost smiled at that. Then he asked, careful, like a man not sure he had the right to ask it, whether she thought his own bottom ground could be saved the same way, and she said she didn't rightly know, because her method had come out of a book that only covered this 40 acres and none other, and even then it hadn't finished proving itself. That doubt sat heavy on her after he left. Lying awake with Caleb's breathing steady through the wall, she turned the question over the way she'd turn a stone looking for what crawled underneath it. 9 ridges wasn't the swamp bottom hole. She had thrown up 9 and lost parts of 4 to the frost, and mended what she could with the level Grover had brought, but she had not tested them against anything harder than a wet spell and a hard freeze. What if the water came up not in inches but in feet? The way old-timers still talked about the flood of '38 that had taken 3 families' corn cribs down the Lavisa in a single night. What if she had built something just strong enough to fool her into confidence and weak enough to fail exactly when it mattered? She thought of Elwood Bowling's flat, unbothered voice offering her money for ground he plainly believed was worth nothing more than what a fool woman had poured into it. And some nights that voice sounded less like an insult and more like a mercy she was too stubborn to take. She did not tell Grover about those nights. She did not tell Caleb either, though she suspected the boy knew something of it from the way she'd taken to standing at the window past midnight, coffee gone cold in her hand, watching the black shape of the ridgeline she couldn't see anymore in the dark but knew was there anyway, the way you know the shape of your own hand in a lightless room. What she did instead, on the clearest cold morning in early March, was walk the whole line of the bottom alone, boots breaking through skim ice in the low spots, and count 9 ridges standing. Two of them slumped at the shoulder where the frost had worked hardest, needing shoring before the thaw finished. She made note of exactly where, in a notebook of her own now, separate from Vesta's, because his had carried her this far, but the next stretch of ground was going to need pages he'd never written. She found tucked between two fence posts near the lowest bend of the property, a heron standing motionless in the shallow backwater that hadn't been there in December, watching the current the way herons do, waiting on something to move beneath the surface before it would. She stood there a long while in the cold, watching the bird watch the water, and thought that maybe the land itself was telling her the same thing. Green Lawson's face had told her. And the same thing the rising creek had told him. Something was coming, sooner than the almanac said it ought to. And there wasn't a soul in the county, herself included, who knew for certain yet whether 9 ridges of drained and mounded swamp bottom would be enough to stand against it. The rain started on a Tuesday and did not stop being polite about it until Thursday night, and by Friday morning, the creek that fed the bottom had swallowed its own banks and gone looking for more ground to call its own. Ruby heard it before she saw it, the way you hear a truck on the county road before its lights swing across the ceiling, a low continuous sound that wasn't quite the wind and wasn't quite anything she had a name for, just a pressure in the air that made Grover's old bird dog whine at the porch steps and refuse to go down them. She stood at the window, with the coffee gone cold in her hand, exactly the way she had 100 nights that winter, except this time the black shape of the ridgeline wasn't hidden by darkness. It was hidden by water. Water standing in sheets across the flat ground on either side of the drainage line, catching the grey morning light and throwing it back up at the sky. And out of that water, the ridges stood. 9 of them, and the 2 she'd shored up in March, holding same as the rest, backs humped above the flood like the spine of something old and stubborn lying down in a river and refusing to be moved by it. She set the coffee cup on the sill without looking at it, and she was out the door before Caleb had his boots half-laced, and Grover was already coming down from his place on the hill, with his slicker flapping open because he hadn't taken the time to button it, and none of them said a word to each other for the better part of a mile, because there wasn't a word big enough yet for what they were walking toward. The county road above Green Lawson's place had already gone under by the time Ruby reached the fence line that separated her bottom from his flat 40. She could see him out there, waist-deep in his own drowned corn, trying to herd cattle that had no herding left in them, that were swimming in slow circles with their eyes rolled white and their bellow carrying up over the water like something out of an old hymn nobody wanted sung. His good bottomland, the flat, clean-plowed acres he'd bragged on at the co-op counter every season for as long as Ruby could remember, had turned into a lake with fence posts sticking out of it like grave markers. And there was nothing standing between that water and his barn but 70 more yards of open ground and a low spot that had already started to sheet over. Ruby. His voice came across the water rough and stripped of everything but need. Ruby, I can't get to the low 40. The truck won't make it, and if that water gets another foot higher, it's into the barn. She didn't answer him with words at first. She looked at the shape of her own bottom, the 9 backs of the ridges rising out of the flood with the drainage running clean and orderly between them, the way Vesta had drawn it in the notebook 15 years before either of them had known there'd be a flood like this to test it against. Water moving off the high ground and down the channels he'd mapped, instead of pooling and standing and rotting everything it touched. Her corn, planted along the crowns of those ridges back in April, stood green and unbothered above the waterline, roots dry, stalks straight, not a leaf of it drowned. She thought about all the mornings Green Lawson had leaned against the pump at the filling station and called her a fool to Elwood Bowling's face and anybody else who'd stand still long enough to listen. And she thought about Caleb's set jaw, the day he came home from school with somebody's father's words in his mouth, and she thought for one clean second about simply turning around and walking home and letting the water finish teaching Green Lawson the lesson he'd earned. Then she thought about Vesta, about what he would have done, standing where she stood, looking at a drowning man across a fence line. Grover, she said, get the mules. Caleb, run to the house and bring every sandbag we filled back in the winter. All of it, don't leave one. And to Green Lawson, raising her voice to carry over the water, get your cattle up on my ridges. They'll hold weight. Bring what you can save and bring it now. There's no time to argue about whose ground it's standing on. He looked at her for the length of 3 long heartbeats, a man who had spent a year and a half building his pride into a wall between them. And then the wall came down the only way pride ever really comes down, which is all at once, under pressure, with no ceremony to it. He turned and started driving the cattle toward the fence gap. Ruby was already wading toward to open. What happened over the next 6 hours became the kind of thing Hickory Hollow told and retold for years afterward, though every telling smoothed some detail, the actual hours hadn't had room to be neat about. Ruby and Grover and Caleb worked that fence gap and the low crossing between the two properties like they drilled for it, though they hadn't, though nobody drills for a flood. You just meet it with whatever your hands already know. The mules hauled sandbags. Caleb, 16 and soaked to the bone and moving like a grown man, built a low shore-up berm across the crossing, with his mother directing him from 10 feet off, both of them shouting over the water and neither of them once raising a voice in anger. Green Lawson's cattle came across the gap in a long, frightened line and climbed the flanks of Ruby's ridges and stood there, 40 head of them, packed shoulder to shoulder on ground that a year before had been named the ugliest, most worthless piece of dirt in the county and did not go under. By the time the rain let up near dusk, Elwood Bowling had come out from town in his truck, as far as the truck would go, and then walked the rest, drawn by word passing house to house, the way word does in a place too small for telephones to matter more than porches. He stood at the fence with his hat already ruined by rain and watched Green Lawson's whole herd standing dry and unbothered on 9 ridges of drained swamp bottom, while the man's own flat 40 lay under 4 feet of brown water with only the barn roof and a few fence posts showing. "Lord," Elwood said to no one in particular. She built an ark and didn't even know it. Ruby heard him. She was too tired to laugh and too proud not to smile a little, standing there with mud to her hips and her hair plastered flat, and Caleb beside her breathing hard, and Grover behind them both with his hand pressed to the small of his back the way it had started paying him for the day's work. She said nothing at all, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The ridges were saying it for her. The water held for 4 more days before it began its slow retreat back into the creek bed where it belonged, and when it was low enough to walk the bottom again, half the county came to look, the way people will come to look at a thing once they've heard about it second-hand and can't quite square the story with what they'd always believed. Green Lawson came every day that week, first to move his surviving cattle back to dry ground, and then, once that was done, simply to walk the ridges with a shovel over his shoulder and ask Ruby questions in a voice that had none of the old edge left in it. How deep had Vesta cut the channels? How had he known to angle the third ridge the way he had, against what looked like the natural fall of the land? Whether a man could learn to read ground like that, or whether it took a particular kind of grief to make a person look at a swamp and see anything in it worth saving. It takes a caderno full of years he didn't live to see used, Ruby told him, which wasn't quite an answer and was the truest one she had. The county agent came out from the extension office in July, a serious young woman named Odell Fry who'd read about the flood in the paper and wanted photographs of the drainage pattern for a report she was compiling on erosion control for the whole watershed. She walked the ridges with a clipboard and a level, and at the end of 2 hours she told Ruby, in the flat, careful language of somebody trained not to overstate a finding, that what Vesta had drawn in that notebook 15 years earlier was close enough to a modern contour ridge system that she'd be citing it, with Ruby's permission as a working local example for other landowners along the creek. Ruby gave her permission. She did not tell her about the nights she'd stood at the window not knowing if 9 ridges would be enough, because that part wasn't a fact for a report. That part belonged to her and to Vesta, and to the cold March mornings when a heron had stood in the shallows, watching the water the way she'd learned, eventually to watch it too. Elwood Bowling came back one last time in August, hat in hand. The same man who'd once looked at the swamp bottom and called it worth $12 an acre if she was lucky to find a fool to take it off her hands. He'd heard, he said, that half the flat land along the creek had lost a full season's crop to the flood, and that hers, sitting up on those ridges, had come through green and whole, and he wanted to know plainly what she'd take for the parcel now. He named a figure that would have seemed like a fortune to her a year and a half before, back when the bank envelope sat unopened on the kitchen table and every option in front of her looked like losing something. Ruby looked past him at the bottom, at the ridges standing green under the August sun with Caleb walking the third row checking for tassel, at the fence line where Green Lawson's cattle had once stood shoulder to shoulder on ground he'd never respected. And she thought of Vesta's handwriting in the margins of the notebook, faded now nearly to nothing in places from all the times her thumb had turned those pages in the dark. "It's not for sale, Elwood," she said. "It never was. You just hadn't figured out yet what you were looking at." He nodded slow, the way a man nods when he's finally caught up to something everybody else in the county worked out months before him, put his hat back on and walked back to his truck without another word, because there wasn't one left that would have changed her mind or needed to. That evening, Ruby sat on the porch with the notebook open on her knee, the leather gone soft and dark with handling. and Caleb beside her with a glass of buttermilk sweating in his hand, and Grover in the rocker they'd carried down special from his place because his hip didn't favor the porch steps at his own house anymore. The frogs were starting up down in the bottom, the whole chorus of them rising out of the drainage channels. Vesta had cut before either she or Caleb had known his handwriting well enough to trust it, and somewhere out past the ridges a whip-poor-will called twice and went quiet. "You ever think," Caleb said, "that Daddy knew, not just guessed, knew?" Ruby ran her thumb along the edge of a page where the ink had run once, years ago, before she'd ever thought to keep the notebook out of the rain. "I think he knew ground the way some men know weather," she said. "Knew it'd flood again someday, same as it always had, and knew a woman with patience enough could turn that into a blessing instead of a curse, if she was willing to do the work nobody wanted to do first. She didn't need Vesta's notebook to write in anymore, not the way she had that first cold spring, but she kept it on the shelf by the door all the same, where she could reach it in the dark. 'Cause a piece of ground nobody wants can turn, in time and with enough stubborn faith, into the only ground that holds when the water comes for everybody else's. That's the kind of thing the land doesn't forget, and neither, in the end, does the person who bet everything on believing it first. If a story like Ruby's ever put steel back in your own spine, if you've ever stood on ground somebody told you was worthless and decided to find out for yourself, we'd love to have you with us here at Grandmother's Land. Subscribe and come back for the next one. There's always another woman the land never forgot.